There is a version of Rome that lives in our imagination: marble columns, togas, an unbroken bloodline stretching back to Romulus, to Aeneas, to a single founding people who conquered the known world and somehow stayed, generation after generation, the same people the whole time. For centuries, this is the Rome we were taught. One city, one stock, one continuous Roman identity, passed down like an heirloom from the Republic to the Empire to the fall. Scientists just spent 12,000 years of buried bone proving that version wrong. The history books say Rome was built by Romans and stayed Roman. The genetics say something else entirely. And once you see what the DNA actually shows, you will never look at a Roman bust the same way again. Ask most people what a Roman looked like, and you'll get a fairly specific image. Mediterranean, Italian, descended in an unbroken line from the tribes of Latium, who founded a city on 7 hills around 753 BCE. This is the story embedded in centuries of art, in Renaissance paintings, in Hollywood epics, in textbooks that quietly treat Roman as a fixed ethnic category, the way we might describe a modern nationality. The empire, in this telling, was something Romans built and then ruled over from a distance. Conquerors from one place, extending control over many other places. Rome exported its people, its language, its law, its legions. It did not, according to this popular imagination, fundamentally change who Rome itself was made of. For nearly 2,000 years, this was simply assumed, repeated, carved into the way we teach ancient history. Nobody actually knew for certain, because until very recently, nobody had the tools to check. Here is what almost nobody tells you. Despite 2,000 years of scholarship, despite Rome being arguably the most written about civilization in human history, scientists knew astonishingly little about the actual biological makeup of the people who lived there. Historians had letters, tax records, inscriptions, coins, ruins, the bones themselves sitting quietly in museum drawers. What they didn't have was direct genetic evidence of who these people were, where their ancestors originated, and how that composition shifted across centuries of war, trade, and conquest. Was Rome, across its rise and fall, a genetically stable population defending a fixed identity behind its walls? Or was something else happening beneath the surface, something the written record, produced almost entirely by elite men with their own agendas, was never designed to capture? For most of the 20th century, the closest anyone could get to an answer was skeletal measurement, a blunt and often unreliable method, or cautious inference from names on tombstones, which tell you what someone called themselves, not necessarily where their ancestors originated. Neither approach could settle the question. Ancient DNA suddenly made that question answerable for the first time. And once researchers could actually look, the picture that emerged was far stranger and far more revealing than the marble statue version of history had prepared anyone for. In 2019, a team of geneticists led by researchers at Stanford University, working alongside archaeologists across Italy, published findings in the journal Science that amounted to the first real genetic history of Rome ever assembled. They sequenced 127 ancient genomes recovered from 29 archaeological sites in and around the city, spanning an almost unimaginable stretch of time, 12,000 years, from hunter-gatherers who roamed the region long before Rome existed, through the founding of the Republic, through the peak of imperial power, and into the medieval centuries after the Western Empire's collapse. Some of the burials came from ordinary cemeteries outside the city walls. Others came from the busy port town of Ostia and from Isola Sacra, a burial ground for the working people who kept Rome's harbor running, sailors, dockhands, laborers, exactly the kind of people official history rarely bothered to name. This was not a study of a single mummy, a single emperor, or a single royal skeleton pulled from a famous tomb. It was a population-level reconstruction, genome by genome, century by century, of who actually lived, worked, and died in and around the Eternal City, and where, generations earlier, their ancestors had come from. But the DNA results showed something no one expected. The first surprises were prehistoric, long before Rome ever existed as an idea. The region underwent a dramatic population shift when farming arrived from Anatolia and the Near East roughly 7,000 years ago, largely replacing the hunter-gatherer populations who had lived there before. A second shift followed in the Bronze Age, when new ancestry linked to the Eurasian steppe swept into the Italian peninsula, arriving alongside new technologies and new trade connections. By the time Rome was traditionally founded, the local population already resembled the mixed Mediterranean populations we would recognize today. That alone complicates the idea of an original, undiluted founding people standing at the birth of the city. But the real twist, the one that was about to turn the academic understanding of Roman identity upside down, came later. As Rome expanded from a small city-state into an empire controlling the entire Mediterranean basin, the genetic makeup of its own population changed again, and this time dramatically. During the height of the imperial period, the data reveal a substantial wave of ancestry from the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East flowing directly into the population of Rome itself. The city did not simply rule an empire of diverse peoples from a comfortable distance behind marble walls. It absorbed those peoples, generation after generation, directly into its own bloodlines. Researchers detected these shifts by comparing the ancient genomes against reference populations from across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East, plotting each individual's genetic position relative to those groups and modeling plausible sources of incoming ancestry. The pattern that emerged wasn't a single clean line of descent. It was a mosaic, individual by individual, some burials showing ancestry almost entirely local, others showing a genetic profile far closer to populations from modern-day Lebanon, Syria, or Greece. Rome's population, in other words, was never one thing at any given moment. It was many things, layered on top of each other, living side by side in the same crowded city blocks. Why would this happen? The answer lies in understanding what Rome actually was, at its core. Not a homeland quietly exporting soldiers outward, but a magnet pulling the entire known world inward. Trade routes converged on the capital from every direction. Enslaved people were brought in chains from every province under Roman control, their labor and their descendants absorbed into the city's population over time. Merchants, administrators, sailors, soldiers, and their families relocated to the world's largest city, home to more than 1 million residents at its height, drawn there by opportunity, by military obligation, or by force they had no say in. Genetic ancestry from North Africa, from Greece, from Anatolia, from Syria and the wider Levant, flowed into Rome along the very same roads and shipping lanes that carried grain, olive oil, wine, and marching legions. The empire's shifting geopolitics were, quite literally, being written into the DNA of the people living at its center. Wait until you see what happened after that. When the Western Empire eventually collapsed and its Mediterranean trade connections frayed and broke apart, the genetic pattern shifted once again, with ancestry from continental Europe becoming steadily more prominent in the population that remained behind in the ruins. Picture a merchant ship pulling into the harbor at Ostia sometime in the 2nd century, its hold packed with grain from Egypt, glassware from the Levant, and passengers who had no intention of ever sailing home again. A soldier from Syria finishing his term of service and settling near the city with a small pension and a Roman name. A woman from Alexandria marrying into a Roman household and raising children who would think of themselves, without contradiction, as fully Roman. None of this was exceptional. It was simply how the largest city on earth kept renewing itself, generation after generation, absorbing the empire it claimed to rule. This finding carries real weight for how we think about ancient identity itself. Roman was never, even deep in antiquity, a description of a single, unbroken bloodline. It functioned closer to a legal and cultural status, something a person could acquire through citizenship, military service, or gradual assimilation, rather than something inherited exclusively through ancestry alone. The genetic data now backs up what a handful of historians had long argued from the written record alone, often against significant resistance. Roman identity was porous by design. A soldier born in Syria, a merchant born in Alexandria, a freed slave born in Gaul, all of them could become, functionally and legally, fully Roman within a generation or two. The DNA shows that this was never just a convenient legal fiction dressed up for the history books. It was demographic reality, playing out quietly, generation after generation, inside the very city that gave the empire its name and its mythology. This finding lands very differently depending on who is doing the looking, and that is precisely why it matters now. For centuries, various nationalist and ethno-purist movements have reached for ancient Rome as a symbol of civilizational purity, an unbroken European lineage worth defending at any cost. The ancient DNA tells a far messier, far more interesting story than that. A city continuously built and rebuilt by newcomers, a capital whose genetic composition tracked its political fortunes almost like a barometer tracks the weather. When Rome absorbed the eastern Mediterranean, its own population reflected that absorption. When the empire fractured and its networks collapsed, the population shifted again in response. There was no golden, static, ethnically sealed core sitting quietly at the center, waiting to be protected from outsiders. There was only continuous, ongoing arrival, layered century upon century upon century, until the very idea of a pure origin dissolves under the weight of the evidence. It is worth pausing here because this is not a small correction to a footnote. It is a correction to one of the most persistent origin myths in Western culture, the idea that great civilizations begin with one people and decline only when outsiders arrive. The genetic record from Rome suggests almost the opposite sequence. The city grew strongest while it was absorbing outsiders fastest, and its slow transformation in later centuries tracked the empire's retreat, not some prior moment of purity being contaminated. Historians had debated this for decades using texts alone. The bones simply confirmed it. Rome's DNA, in the end, is not really a story about Rome at all. It's a story about what any large, connected, powerful civilization inevitably becomes over time. Not a fortress built to keep one people safe and separate, but a living crossroads, absorbing many peoples into itself. The city that built roads reaching every corner of the known world eventually carried the ancestry of that entire world back into its own body, quietly, patiently, invisibly, for centuries. History is not written only in stone, in parchment, or in the speeches of emperors who wanted to be remembered a certain way. It is written, far more honestly, into the genome of every person who ever called a place home, passed down layer by layer, generation by generation, until a laboratory 2,000 years later finally learned how to read it correctly. The past isn't a fixed inheritance handed down unchanged. It's a record of constant motion. And Rome, the city we were taught to imagine as eternal and unchanging, turns out to have never been standing still at all. 12,000 years, 127 genomes, and one very old myth finally laid to rest.